Dynamic voices for a diverse church. This is Pass the Mic. Welcome to Pass the Mic. I'm your producer, Bo York. With me is your normal host, the co-founder of the Reformed African American Network, Mr. Jemar Tisby. Jemar, how are you doing tonight?
Such a loaded question, given the circumstances. Right. If I speak honestly, I can just say I've been better. That's what I've been saying all day.
Well, honesty is what we're after, man. This is just to kind of give some framework for where we are as we record this podcast live. It is November 9th. The election of 2016 has come and gone, and we now sit with President-elect Donald Trump.
I'm still not used to that.
Well, so we, from time to time, at Pass the Mic, we will experience moments where the community of listeners, of RAN readers, there's almost an outcry for there to be kind of a sense of community, a sense of emotion, just a way to kind of direct and process through thought and through speaking and really kind of having someone help think through what's going on right now. This episode, the goal is to kind of be very raw. It's not planned. It's not scripted. There are some scripted questions that I have in front of me, but really, man, this is kind of an opportunity for just, I think, a lot of us to kind of hear your thoughts as we all process our own emotions with where we are. For many of us, for those in the African American community and minorities, those of us who've been working towards racial reconciliation, there's a deep sense of lament, I think, that we're all experiencing right now. Can you talk to that and perhaps even frame that up to some extent?
Absolutely. Lament has been really an important concept for me in the past couple of years as we've looked at different events going on in the news that are related to race, particularly deaths of African Americans, oftentimes involved in law enforcement and whatnot. And so we get to these points where the tragedy is so great and so frequent that you're kind of at a loss. And before I had a framework for biblical lament, I really didn't know what to do with that. So lament has come along for me at just the right time to help me process these things. There is biblical grounds for lament. I mean, there's a book called Lamentations in the Bible. The book of Job, he laments constantly throughout that book after tragedy strikes him personally. And he cries out to God and he talks honestly about how he feels. I just want to read a couple verses because I think they're so stark and raw and true. And so this is from Job 16, verses, let's say, 19 to 22. And he says, "Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and he who testifies for me is on high. My friends scorn me. My eye pours out tears to God, that he would argue the case of a man with God as soon as a son of man does with his neighbor. For when a few years have come, I shall go the way from which I shall not return." And it goes on and on and on. But what I really found helpful in thinking through this idea of lament was a book called Prophetic Lament, A Call for Justice in Troubled Times by Dr. Soong-Chan Rah. We actually had him on Pass the Mic just the episode before this. So I invite listeners to go download that episode and hear from Soong-Chan Rah. And in that book, he says this: "Laments are prayers of petition arising out of need, but lament is not simply the presentation of a list of complaints, not merely the expression of sadness over difficult circumstances. Lament in the Bible is a liturgical response to the reality of suffering and engages God in the context of pain and trouble. The hope of lament is that God would respond to human suffering that is wholeheartedly communicated through lament." So that's sort of a framework about lament. And I think it's important because right after the election, I saw all of these people who were not Trump fans or not Trump supporters basically giving calls to action. Like, we need to go out and mobilize, we need to be activists. And that's true. And I agree with that. I just disagree with the timing. I think we need time to sit with our emotions, to grieve, to process before we even think about it on an intellectual level, and certainly before we go out and try to do something.
there's a lot of emotions that are being processed right now. Anger, being kind of chief amongst them. Anger, depression, just a general sense of being upset. Is it okay for we as Christians to be angered by this, to be as upset as many are pouring out? Is it okay to be upset?
Look, we live in a fallen world. We live in a world that's full of sin and brokenness, and it would be profoundly inhuman not to experience frustration, anger, sadness at what we perceive to be injustices. And so the full gamut of emotions is on display in Scripture. And, there are limits to that. The Bible says, be angry and do not sin. But at the same time, it doesn't say don't be angry. It doesn't say don't be sad. These are part of what makes us human is to have a heart about these things. And so I think it is appropriate. People are going to experience different emotions and for different reasons. But as believers, we need to, I think, give each other space to be fully orbed human beings, which would include not just the spiritual, not just the intellectual, but also the emotional dimensions of who we are. And we need to not be afraid of that, especially because, we're part of the Reformed African American Network. We put such a high emphasis on theology and doctrine and these kind of cognitive ways of understanding religion. We really need to give each other space, a positive space for emotion. Now, how to process that and what to do. I can say what I did. Like I had 2 classes today. I'm a graduate student in history at the University of Mississippi, and I told my professors honestly, like I'm literally not feeling well, and I just need some time today because I would have been worthless in class. And so I spent the day, half the day off of social media, which was a long time, given the circumstances. I rested, I ate, I caught a nap because I was up till 3 a.m. watching the results. And that's what it looked like for me. Part of that was lamenting and in prayer and in the Bible. A big part of that was talking to my wife. She was such an anchor for me and a godsend. We spent probably an hour together processing this, and she went to bed way before I did, but she found out the election results first thing in the morning, and before we even said a word to each other, we just hugged. And sometimes words fail you, and this was one of those times. So
yeah. When the election was going on, we were messaging each other back and forth, and before, well before it was called, and the numbers were as high as they were for Trump. I said something to the effect of, to some extent, it doesn't even matter if she wins or loses at this point because the damage is done. There's so much overwhelming support for him that, there is this outcry. But that being the case, obviously one does not become the president without having a large amount of followers behind them. It's fair to say that there may be some listening that don't understand why people are upset about this election result at all.
Well, so, there's a couple levels, right? There's one, in any election, you support a particular candidate, a particular party, and you're going to experience emotions when that candidate and that party doesn't win. So on a very, basic level, there are people who are extremely happy because their candidate won, and there are a lot of people who are extremely disappointed because their candidate lost, and that's nothing unique to this particular election. That's just, there's going to be one winner and lots of different losers in terms of the election. But on a deeper level, this isn't like any election. And this is a massive point that I'm sure we'll flesh out throughout the rest of the conversation. This election, in a sense, was a referendum on American ideals. It felt very much like our stated vision for what it means to be an American and what this nation represents were on trial in this election. And I'm not saying that either candidate perfectly represented those values, but one candidate in particular, the one who ended up winning, for a lot of us, was the antithesis of the highest ideals, particularly diversity and equality, equal opportunity, those kinds of things. So when Trump wins, there's this sense that the nation isn't what we thought it was. It's not what we hoped it was, at the very least. And there is, I think, an understandable sort of lament and heaviness and grief that goes along with that.
Dive in a little bit more. I mean, with the campaign in particular, I think a lot of us who've been working towards racial reconciliation, we've taken it on the chin several times throughout the last couple of years, but something about this really felt like a gut punch that kind of pushed back everything that we've been doing by several steps. I mean, is that a fair feeling? Or is that impacting the emotion that many of us have right now?
Yeah, I feel like it's this. In light of this election, I feel like it's this Sisyphean effort. We're rolling this monumental boulder up a hill, only to have it constantly roll back down on top of us, and have to start from the bottom all over again. And it was extremely. There's like getting the rug pulled out from under you, because here I was. I spent most of my ministry doing the work of racial reconciliation, the work of racial justice. And, I'm going to churches and speaking. I'm making friends and acquaintances online and in person. I'm writing and getting feedback from people. And there's all this energy around racial reconciliation, and people seem to be on board. And then you find out over 80% of people who identify as evangelical, white evangelical, voted for Donald Trump. And so it made me feel as if all of the words that I spent, whether in a presentation or in writing or whatever, those were wasted, because so many of my brothers and sisters in the faith still don't understand where I'm coming from as a racial minority, particularly an African American in this country, and it feels like the work of developing racial unity among believers took a monumental step backwards, or it didn't move at all, and I just thought it was in a different place than it really was. But either way, it was devastating to someone who really takes this idea of racial reconciliation as an issue that's central to the gospel.
The statistics that you mentioned in terms of evangelicals who supported Trump is in particularly painful. And for many that find themselves in churches where they might attend and well, let me ask it this way. For many of us, Christians, we go to our church for times of emotional support. If we're dealing with things in our lives and our marriages, if we've lost a parent or a loved one, if we're going through strife or through just really emotionally hard times, the church is a safe haven to turn to. And in many instances, our pastors are kind of our counselors in that way. With something like this, where there's racial pain that is tied to this election, how would I go to my pastor, especially how would an African American in a predominantly white church go to their pastor and even begin to have the discussion of the pain that they're feeling? Whether with kind of an understanding that based on those statistics, that pastor may have been a Trump supporter.
You told me to be honest, right, Bo?
This is honest.
So I'm going to say where I am, and so I'm really can only definitively speak for me, but I don't think it's going too far out on a limb to say that there are many other Black Christians who may feel the same way. And this is probably going to surprise a lot of white people and maybe even feel offensive to them. But here it is, just the raw, honest truth. I really, this Sunday, don't feel safe worshiping with white people. I go to a church that is predominantly white and Reformed. I am part of a denomination that is overwhelmingly white and Reformed. And I know dozens and dozens and dozens of people personally who are great people individually, good relationships with them, generous, all of those things. But right now, I feel betrayed by the church. Not the church universal. I know that Christ is still the cornerstone. I know that in an eschatological sense, nothing will prevail against the church, and that this is my home. We are Christ's bride, and that hasn't changed, and certainly not because of a little thing like a presidential election. However, let's be real. We live in the real world. On Sunday, I have to go to a physical building with a local congregation filled with people who, just like me, are sinners. And I know for certain that in many of the congregations in which I've been a member or worshiped in, there are folks who were overtly, outright, boldly Trump supporters and are happy right now. And I cannot emotionally bring myself to be comfortable with that. And going in on Sunday morning and singing songs and praying with this group of people who seem so out of touch with my experience of America.
It's painful, right? Because we hear the stats, we hear the talking about evangelicals turning out, and for many of us, we think, well, that's like a false evangelicalism, right? That's a misrepresentation of the gospel. Surely these are not the true Christians. But as you just kind of painted a picture of, I mean, in your very church, I mean, this is happening, and this is of course happening across the nation where many don't feel safe. So how do we process this reality of being in community with people that we are not in community with?
I mean, let me just be historical for a second here. There is no black church without racism and cultural obtuseness, to be generous, in the white church. And to go further, it's not the theology on paper that repels African Americans from majority white churches and institutions. It's theology and practice that does it. And I mean, I'm just being raw and honest here. I want to go to my old black missionary Baptist church where I don't have to explain why I'm sad. I don't have to explain why I had to take a day off from my normal activities. I don't have to fake a smile or somehow pretend like what just happened in this election is okay with me. I want to go to a place. I want to go to the ark, to the refuge, which is what the black church has always been. And for reasons like this, and not to compare, this election to some of the things that African Americans have endured in the past, but it served a similar purpose in the sense of drawing strength from it. But the reality for many of us is that's not an option. That's not an option because we're members at different churches. That's not an option because we may not be in an environment where we have those churches. And it's not, maybe it's just not an option for the long term, maybe this week or next week, but not for the long term. And so what do you do with that? I am not sure. Where I am right now is I'm upset, and I don't feel like putting on a filter. So, I feel like if somebody wants to step to me with, something about Trump that's, positive or affirming or something like that, I'm not here for it. And they're going to get a piece of my mind, hopefully not rudely. But I think in my view, one of my regrets in this whole election cycle is that I wasn't bolder, that I wasn't as forthright with my ideas. And I say that in the context of being bolder than I've ever been about race and politics in my entire life. And I still don't think I was able to really speak my mind. And so I think we do, as African Americans, a disservice to our white brothers and sisters by not being honest. And that doesn't mean being rude, but it also doesn't mean hiding emotions. Emotions are part of this whole thing. And it certainly doesn't mean hiding our opinions. Now, you may agree or disagree, but we should be able to have these conversations, not come down on the same side of things, and lift our hands together and worship. Now that's an ideal, but that's where I am. I've got to speak honestly, because if I don't, ain't a bunch of us in the congregation, and they probably won't hear it from anyone else.
So this morning I was having a conversation with a friend of mine. He's African-American business owner in kind of the local area. We had a kind of an entrepreneurial meetup, and we were just talking. He was like, I'm a Christian, and I'm an evangelical. I'm not, at the end of the day, it's not that I'm afraid or upset or even necessarily against conservative leadership, but the way they painted evangelicals coming out in support for Trump, that's not me. He's not what I represent. And he found himself very much in kind of this moment of, what does it even mean to be a black evangelical today?
I don't use that term. I say I'm confessional. I say I'm Presbyterian. But evangelicalism has always been a loaded term. But in this past year and a half, with this election cycle, it's become a byword. It's always been pretty negatively received by non-Christians outside of the church, but even within the church now, it's a very negative label. So I see lots and lots of white folks not wanting to be labeled evangelical
for a while,
and
now.
black folks, for a while now haven't, because anytime folks brought up evangelical and didn't say white before it, everything they said after that word really only applied to white people, particularly white men. It was not a descriptive term, and so I don't use the term. And for black people, look, we have theological convictions that would line up with the theological convictions of evangelicals. Centrality of the Bible, emphasis on a personal relationship with Jesus for salvation, those kinds of things. We line up with that. We don't have a problem with that. The issue is, this is not really a religious label so much as a political and a cultural one. And it's those political and cultural stances that many African Americans are the antithesis of and take massive issue with, me included. So, I don't identify as an evangelical, at least, without crazy nuance, which is basically saying, theologically, scripturally, biblically, I would line up with some of those same beliefs, but on the political and the cultural and the social end, no, not me.
Well, let's push it a little bit further. Because evangelical is political code language for Christian, I mean, that's kind of the further push of the question, right? What does it mean today to be a black Christian in America?
Well, I mean, it certainly doesn't mean one thing, right? So I'll speak sort of from my branch of Christianity, which is in particular Reformed, but more broadly kind of just theologically traditional, particularly on, kind of sexual ethics, right to life, those kinds of things, would take a traditional stance on it. But to be black and Christian, or black and at least theologically evangelical, means you are in a hinterland, religiously and socially. You're in this in between space where you don't quite belong, and then everybody feels to a certain extent like the person on the outside of the circle. But I'm saying as an entire people group, as an entire race who believes the gospel and is involved in predominantly white evangelical circles, is tough. It's tough. It's tough because just in terms of worship, the style's very different. They call my denomination the frozen chosen, because they don't move, they don't speak, they don't do anything that would be associated with many traditional black churches. And so you're dealing with that. you're dealing with, what illustrations and applications does the pastor use? Does it connect with you on a day-to-day cultural level? What songs are they singing? What's the composition of the congregation? So you've got all of that going on, but then you've got sort of more ideological differences as well. So on social issues, you can look at the past couple of years when incidents happened like Trayvon Martin, like Mike Brown, like Eric Garner, like so many others. These human beings reduced to hashtags because of violence, and the way that white evangelicals and black Christians have responded so differently. Because for black people, these incidents, I always think it could have been me. And if not me, somebody I know who looks like me. It's not hypothetical. It's real. It's real out there in the streets. This is an existential reality. It is racism. It is hatred taken out on physical bodies in violent manner, and that could happen to me at a traffic stop or walking down the street. And so I'm going to react to that differently than somebody who's not in that position, because the color of their skin in this culture doesn't mean the same thing. So we're in this in-between phase where, African Americans, particularly the ones who go to mainly white churches, if something like that happens, another hashtag or something like that, they're sitting there sort of wondering, is my pastor going to talk about this Sunday? Mm-hmm. Are people going to address this? And if they do, are they going to dismiss my pain? Are they going to understand where I'm coming from? Are they going to weep with me? Are they going to judge me? Are they going to disagree with me and argue with me? That's a terrible place to be, particularly in the church, but it's where we are.
The outcome of this election, because of the campaign that came before it, because of the rhetoric that was used, because of the people groups that rallied behind Trump, endorsement directly by the KKK. There's those of us that see the outcome of this election as almost the embodiment of racial injustice. But those of us who feel that way, we're a small contingent within our church. What do we do? Where do we go from here? What are our next steps in terms of fighting racial injustice from a biblical standpoint within our own churches and ideally beyond?
What I hope we don't do is pretend like we're further than we are, because if anything this election has shown us is that we as Christians who believe these certain things that many would associate with evangelicalism, we are not nearly as far along in racial reconciliation as we thought. Doesn't mean there hasn't been progress. There's growth in number of intentionally multiracial churches. There's interracial marriages happening. There's dialogue happening. There are white Christians who are quote unquote woke. That's real, and that's good. But this has been extremely sobering for me personally to think about people, not abstract people I have real relationships with. I know, I call, I text, I go to church with, have lunch with, whatever. Real live people who I know. We are so far apart in our understanding of American culture and our experience of this nation that I'm like, we got to start from scratch. We got to start all over almost. So we got to be honest with ourselves. To me, here's this. A fundamental issue. We have got to understand racism more broadly. We have got to move beyond the idea that racism is purely interpersonal and relational, which means the problem is, I harbor personal hatred or animus towards somebody who looks different. So I say the N-word, or I say, you can't come in here, you can't sit next to me, whatever it is. And therefore, the solution to that kind of racism is to be nice to everybody and have your black friend and go out to coffee with people. And in that way, because you're building relationships and you're not harboring hatred towards someone because of their skin color or culture or something, you're doing your part. Well, yes, we need that, but that relational aspect is necessary but not sufficient. What we need to do is really begin to dismantle the systems, the policies, the practices embedded in our churches, embedded in our institutions, embedded in our ministries that continue to separate and divide us. And I'll put it on the line. If you want to know where segregation begins, it's not in the church necessarily. It's where we choose to live, and it's where we choose to send our kids to school or go to school ourselves. And that's going to take, to break down those lines of segregation, some real tough choices. Because now you're talking about, well, I can go to a school that's really high performing and give my child the chance at academic success, or I can be, a pioneer and make sure my child goes to a place that has some diversity. Or you're talking about living in a neighborhood that has a nice tax bracket and sidewalks and manicured lawns versus a place that has more diversity but may not have as much affluence. That gets real. So if we want to have diversity on Sunday, we better pursue it Monday through Saturday as well. And that's hard to do, but there's no other way around it, particularly for Christians in the majority, to really begin to understand what life is like for minorities, and in particular African Americans.
Man, that's a podcast in and of itself.
Yep.
It seems like every single year, or that is to say, every single election cycle, the rhetoric gets more polarizing. Everything kind of amps up a notch. There's always this, general growth of fear from election to election. Can you kind of compare or look a little bit at this election as opposed to the previous elections? And I'm thinking very specifically about the fact that we are making this transition from Barack Obama to Donald Trump, two very polar opposites on almost every level.
You warned us about getting too political on these podcasts, and so we won't compare the politics, right? There's always going to be policy differences between people, no matter how closely you align religiously. And so apart from the actual policies and let's just talk about character. Yeah. Let's just talk about image. Let's just talk about role model potential. Barack Obama is looking pretty darn good right now. I don't care if you voted for him or not. This is a family man. He's had no major personal scandals. He elevates his wife. He elevates his daughters. Women were proud and empowered to see this black man, affirming women nationally. He has composed himself in the face of vicious, racist, personal attacks, including the birther movement, that he wasn't even born here, that he's not an American, that he's not that he's Muslim, and all of these things in the midst of all that, and he's endured these national tragedies, from school shootings to church shootings. So he's not been a perfect president by any means in terms of policies or decisions or things like that. But in terms of somebody that I could point my black son to and say, listen, go to an Ivy League school. You can do it. Become a lawyer, become a senator, become president. Love your family like this, man. I don't feel any qualms about pointing to someone like Barack Obama. Can we say the same for Donald Trump? I can't. Absolutely not. Instead of pointing to the president as someone for my child to emulate, I'm pointing to the president as someone to warn my child about. And I think that's a travesty. I think that's a failure on the part of American citizenship.
Well, we're kind of coming down to the line here, but I know you had wanted to talk a little bit about pious pragmatism.
All right. So you wait till the end of the podcast to get me in trouble. Listen, this is the thing, and this is what's going to divide even Christians who thought they were close on some issues. This is like the third rail of this election. As an African American listening to Donald Trump, the way the Ku Klux Klan feels emboldened by him and will publicly support him, and he'll just kind of hem and haw about their support, not reflexively repudiate it like anyone with a conscience. the way he talks about the African Americans or my African Americans, this kind of papering over any sort of distinctions or nuances, I mean, it's almost like we're little pets or something in his rallies. The amount of Confederate I went and observed at a Trump rally. I'm not speaking about this just from the media. I went and observed at a Trump rally, and the amount of Confederate flags I saw, I literally felt unsafe. And somebody contacted me about that and ticked me off because they're like, "Well, you shouldn't feel that way." I did. I'm an African American. This country has a history, and if we don't know that history, it can be fatal for people like me. I don't feel comfortable in a Trump America because we've been down this road before as a nation and as African Americans. And it doesn't end well when somebody, even if it's just rhetoric from the top, it'll turn into actions at the grassroots level. And people, there's one of my good friends who's an African American, staunch Democrat, devastated by this election. He was dropping his daughter off at school today. Good family man, married, 2 kids, 2 beautiful daughters, African American, dropping his daughter off at daycare. Somebody drives by and pointedly to him starts shouting, "Trump, Trump, 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 Trump." His daughter witnessed that. She's like, "What is this?" He's there. How does he feel in this America? How do I feel in this America? And for my white brothers and sisters not to even understand that, that is a huge blow to what we call racial reconciliation in the church. So all that to say, I could not risk a Donald Trump presidency. And the reality is, statistically speaking, only 2 candidates were viable to be president the next 4 years. And I think Carl Ellis put it best, oppression limits your good choices. Injustice limits your good choices. And so in an imperfect world where it's not just, we don't always get to choose the ideal candidate or take even an idealistic stance and risk the physical safety of people, the mental safety of people, and the cries of our brothers and sisters in Christ. So I think we need to think deeply about this. This is politics. This is doing government in a real gritty, sinful world. What does that look like? And it's not always going to be, this sunny, bright land where I voted my conscience and there aren't serious and damaging repercussions. So we need to exercise, I think, given the state of the world we're in, a sort of pious pragmatism that will do the least harm, even as we regroup and try to make sure that we have more palatable and desirable candidates in the future. Put it that way.
Well, I think one thing's for sure, man. We've got a lot of work to do.
Man, we got more work to do than I ever thought. Okay. Anybody who's listening, don't start yet asking the question, what do we do now? What do we do next? Don't, or rather, understand that lament is a form of action and protest. I genuinely believe, and it's worked for me even just today. I could use the rest of the week off, but I got to get back to the real world tomorrow. But even just taking a day has refreshed me, has given me some perspective, calling friends, processing with people. That's the work right now. And to pastors and church leaders, I would just say, don't wait for the minorities in your congregation to come to you. Don't keep them guessing till Sunday. Reach out and let them know, hey, I just can't imagine what this moment is like for you right now. Would you share so you could help me understand, or do you just want to weep together, or whatever I can do for you? Or even just to say, look, I don't know what I'm going to say in the sermon, but I'm thinking about you, and I want you to be at home in the church. Like, I want everyone to be at home in the church. But, be proactive, I think. And then, reaching out. Can we practice love? Can we just love one another in this time and grieve together, and we'll figure out what to do next. I promise you it'll become clear.
Oh, amen to that. Well, hey, we want to thank you all so much for taking your time tonight to join us for this live show. For me and for Jemar and for all of us at RAN, we want to thank y'all for tuning in, and we will see you next time on the next Pass the Mic.
Pass the Mic.